What's good, fam? Progress is going good on the Brujah videos. Script is done. I just wanted to take a short break from all the friggin' lore deep diving and script writing, and I just wanted to bring you a more casual kind of video, specifically talking about some of the entries from Tier 1 of the iceberg. Oh, shout out to the patrons. Anyway, just jumping into it. So the first one I wanted to talk about a little bit more was the Book of Nod. The Book of Nods. So yes, not the definitive backstory to the undead, though it is certainly a damn good one. Of course, watch the Caine Lilith vid. Also, I don't know if you noticed this, here's another little iceberg entry for you. If you notice the logo on the front of Nodism, the skull actually represents Cain. You can see the 3 second generation Enosh, Jyhad, and Zilla, and then you can see the 13 antediluvians, so there you go, another extra iceberg entry for you. What I wanted to talk about, though, with the Book of Nod, that's always been on my mind, is not the contents of the Book of Nod themselves, you know, the Cain and Lilith, the Garden of Eden, that whole thing. I more so wanted to talk about the meta plot that surrounds the creation of the Book of Nod itself. There's actually a whole story and an in-universe lore reason as to why you and I can get a hold of copies of this book. It isn't just like a source book that was made. There's actually like a lot of extra lore going on behind specifically this version of the Book of Nod. So, the Book of Nod, as you recall, is a collection of fragments and translations gathered from all over the world, though primarily in the Middle East. It is specifically compiled by the gangrel Cuthbert Beckett and his adopted sire, Aristotle de Laurent. Beckett, as you most likely know, is one of the main characters, one of, if not the main characters of Vampire the Masquerade, who is constantly running around the world and uncovering secret knowledge. Aristotle de Laurent, the scholar that Beckett was working with when compiling this Book of Nod, is a Malkavian Frenchman who belongs to a specific faction of other Malkavians, or a cult of Malkavians known as the Mnemosyne. The Mnemosyne are a cult of Malkavians who are, very simply put, they're obsessed with seeking knowledge, and they are not directly affiliated with any of the major sects like the Camarilla or the Sabbat, for example. The Mnemosyne operates on their own terms. What can I say more so about them? They are so obsessed with knowledge that when their mind reaches a point where, you know, they hit that eldritch limit and they start seeing, you know, terrible truths of the beyond, right? And then their mind starts breaking apart. They actually voluntarily give themselves up to be diablerized or cannibalized by another younger member of the Mnemosyne so that that vampire can take on the mantle and the burden of knowledge and carry on the torch, so to speak. You still with me? Beckett is not a Malkavian, but he is now a member of the Mnemosyne, and he is actually, as I mentioned, his adopted sire, so I guess you could say his new mentor, his new teacher, being a member of the Mnemosyne, Aristotle de Laurent. So with all that in mind, the Book of Nod itself, this Book of Nod, doesn't just start with the story of Cain and Lilith, and in the beginning, you know, there was darkness and etc. It actually begins with a preface, a forewarning letter from Aristotle de Laurent, which was intended for only a select few to see. You see, upon finishing this collection of the Book of Nod, Aristotle and Beckett were hit with a bit of a dilemma. This kind of information is extremely sought after by factions like the Sabbat and is essentially illegal. This is like propaganda to factions like the Camarilla. In other words, this information is problematic across the board, having this information. The Book of Nod, 2 other vampires, this book is an issue, right? So when Beckett and Aristotle finished their compilation, as I mentioned, they were hit with a dilemma. Do they risk sharing the Book of Nod with the world at large, or at least with, you know, other individuals, other scholars, to get a second opinion on it? You know, maybe they mistranslated something. Maybe they have a, you know, the more eyes on this, the better, right? This entire Book of Nod is and still is a collection of opinions from only 2 people. 2 extremely intelligent vampires, but you know, one is a Malkavian. Anyway, this dilemma. So, do they share it with the world at large, or at least a select few people at the risk of exposing the Book of Nod to the night? Or do they keep it to themselves and we only have this biased perspective of theirs. We don't get that extra academic lens. Ultimately, the decision was made to share the Book of Nod with what was intended to be an extremely select few group of people, like 2 or 3 other vampires. However, as we will discuss later, that would be a massive mistake. Actually, a mistake so bad that it resulted in people like me being able to buy the Book of Nod. It resulted in the greatest masquerade breach of all time. Anyway, the preface itself within the Book of Nod reads as follows. And this is important because basically the preface summarizes the several hundred years that Aristotle de Laurent spends doing Indiana Jones stuff in the name of knowledge. He's been all over the place. From New York to Dublin, Cairo to Casablanca, all sorts of places, right? Some of his more interesting encounters involves his interactions with a Methuselah that actually taught Aristotle ancient Sumerian within a network of underground tunnels underneath the University of Prague. Oh, hi, cat. Here, say hi, cat. There you go. Look at this little lore monger. Look at that sad face. Mwah. Okay, get out of here. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, another cool thing that happened is the time Aristotle learns the discipline Protean from the legendary gangrel Karsh, which I didn't even mention in my gangrel video. It is what it is. There'll be a gangrel part 2 one day. One time, Aristotle finds himself within a tomb of an unspoken or unnamed antediluvian. He just claims it's an antediluvian's tomb, where he finds an ancient copy of a collection, an ancient book of what he presumed to be a Book of Nod, an ancient kind of interpretation of it, and he touches it and watches it crumble to dust right before his eyes. Though, perhaps the most interesting thing to have happened to Aristotle, as he outlines in this preface, is the time in which he learns of the Brujah antediluvian's true name, to which the next evening Aristotle wakes up and finds he's carved his own real name into his flesh, in a sort of acknowledgement that Aristotle could see the Brujah antediluvian and the Brujah antediluvian could see Aristotle back. And so as a result, Aristotle has refused to ever name the Brujah antediluvian's name ever again. He won't even write it down. He accepted the threat. Prefaces like these appear for each of the Chronicles throughout the entirety of the Book of Nod. The first Chronicle, the Chronicle of Cain, which, tells simply the story of how Cain kills his brother Abel and then gets exiled to the land of Nod, has a pretty interesting preface from the side of Beckett's perspective on it, as well as some of the passages within itself, which we'll talk about a little bit after. So, according to Beckett, the story of Cain and Abel, as we know it, is actually a parable of 2 separate tribes that existed at least 8,000 years ago. These 2 tribes were, at least in remembrance, named after their chiefs. The tribe of Abel were herders and keepers of flocks, though they were more primitive than the tribe of Cain. The tribe of Abel worshipped a sun god, while the tribe of Cain worshipped a moon god, or goddess rather. Abel's people regularly attacked Cain's people for their strange ways of moving in darkness and the like. Abel's people ultimately saw Cain's people as inferior and cursed for their dwelling in darkness. In time, Cain would teach his people to use the very tools and sharp things that they once used as tools, like I said, instead as weapons of war. When Abel's tribe rolled up on the tribe of Cain, Cain's people ultimately fought back and destroyed the tribe of Abel entirely. The sun god, as a result, would punish Cain's people. They would destroy their villages and salt Cain's earth. And so the people of Cain would be doomed to wandering for weeks until they eventually hit the point of starvation. It was then that the moon goddess appeared before Cain's people and brought them nourishment, knowledge on how to take care of themselves, and especially knowledge on how to survive off the blood rather than, to survive on blood in a land that is otherwise salted. In time, the sun god would approach Cain in his dreams and essentially give Cain an ultimatum. He would either return to the sun god's people, who at this time were the children of Seth, or he would be cursed to forever dwell in darkness should he refuse the sun god's demands. And you can probably guess what Cain and his people chose. Then, as you could probably guess, the sun god would curse Cain's people to forever dwell in darkness, lest they be scorched by the rays of the sun. Beckett ultimately concludes this theory with the idea that Cain represents man's need for civilization and the humanity that the undead seek. The moon goddess representing the mystery of the vampire's existence in terms of their magical nature of vampiric blood. All in all, though, you could probably see the parable and the connection between the Cain and Abel story that we've regularly discussed and this interpretation involving two tribes. So I don't know, what do you think? Okay, now it's time to break down one of my favorite strange passages within the Chronicle of Cain itself. I'm going to read the passage, and let's see if you can catch the part that stands out, okay? On the altar of our father we laid our sacrifices, and lit fire under them, and watched the smoke carry them up to the one above. The sacrifice of Abel, second-born, smelled sweet to the one above, and Abel was blessed. And I, first-born Cain, I was struck from beyond by a harsh word and a curse, for my sacrifice was unworthy. The passages that immediately follow what I just read essentially tell the point in which Cain picks up his tools, goes to his brother, and offs him, so, makes a sacrifice out of Abel instead. But did any of those lines that I just read stand out to you? I'll read the line again. And I, firstborn Cain, I was struck from beyond by a harsh word and a curse, for my sacrifice was unworthy. So notice something about that. The one above specifically curses Cain for providing an unworthy offering before killing his brother. Cain was cursed prior to killing his brother, to which he would be cursed again. If this translation is correct, and Cain was in fact cursed before even raising a finger against his brother, then think of the ramifications. What if Cain's murder of Abel wasn't out of jealousy or spite, but because he was genuinely scared to fail the one above again? I mean, if your sacrifice was so unworthy to God himself, and so unworthy to the point that you got cursed for it, what would you do when your next sacrifice is demanded? Could that mean that some of the responsibility of Cain's murder can be somewhat placed on the one above himself? If that's the case, then does that mean Genesis itself is lying, or otherwise covering up this dark truth by instead portraying Cain as a simply jealous figure? What if Cain's murder of Abel was actually retribution against the one above directly for the curse that was put on him initially? Does that mean Cain is technically Cain the twice cursed? I hope it does, because that's actually kind of a cool name. Or is Cain simply making up this curse? And this is Cain's attempt at shedding the blame of his own jealousy, perhaps. I mean, Cain was a jealous person after all, and so naturally, wouldn't he bias the story to make himself look more like a victim of circumstance? Well, according to Aristotle and Beckett, the usage of the word curse and being cursed from beyond and the like, in this specific context, seems to refer to quite literally a bolt of lightning, which may have struck Cain as punishment. Or perhaps this bolt simply struck away Cain's unworthy sacrifice. I don't know. What do you think? I should put this much effort into the actual book of Genesis itself. It would be awesome. Save my damn soul. Another strange entry appears within the next chronicle, the coming of Lilith. Pause. In which Lilith saves Cain from the godless wastes of the land of Nod. When Lilith approaches Cain and holds him in her arms, the passage reads as follows. She took me in. She fed me. She clothed me. In her arms I found comfort. I cried until blood trickled from my eyes, and she kissed them away. Did you catch it? When Cain was embraced in Lilith's arms, he cries tears of blood as if he was already a vampire, long before he was actually turned into a vampire. I mean, he wasn't even brought into Lilith's garden at this point, something that would happen shortly after this passage. So, could this be a mistranslation? Or was Cain perhaps made into a vampire before Lilith? Was this a byproduct of the curse placed upon Cain? Who knows? What do you think? Alright, so that's enough of me breaking down some of the passages themselves that is found within the Book of Nod. Now I want to get back to the meta plot surrounding the book's actual creation, with Beckett and Aristotle. So last we left off, Aristotle finally gave in to Beckett's demands of creating more copies of the Book of Nod to share with the rest of the Knight. Aristotle specifically only agrees to the creation of 10 copies of the manuscript of the Book of Nod, which between you and me is already way too much. I figure maybe like 2 or 3, but Aristotle gives in to 10. And a little bit more about Aristotle, by the way. So, little is known about Aristotle de Laurent. Even his name and life is completely forgotten. But what we do know is that he came from the rough side of the French working class, born in the year 1100 or so, specifically in Paris, France. He instead chose to take a more scholarly, philosophical, and academic way of living rather than do what the rest of his family did, which was essentially be in the working class. He attended university, he listened to the teachings of Pierre Abelard, all that good stuff. After all that, at some point in time, Aristotle would eventually get embraced into the clan Malkavian. Oh, and also, Aristotle is obsessed with Greek stuff. He loves Greek literature, Greek philosophy. That probably explains how he might have helped with the prominence of the cult named the Mnemosyne, which is referencing Greek stuff, Greek for keepers of time or something like that. I don't remember, someone's going to correct me in the comments. It also explains his name being Aristotle de Laurent, at least his vampiric nickname, so to speak, the moniker that he goes by. Anyway, all that to say, Aristotle, especially where he was born, where and when he was born, all the way up to now, I mean, just some of the Indiana Jones stuff that we were talking about earlier, some of the adventures he went through, it's understandable that he would only agree to the creation of 10 copies of the Book of Nod, only 10 printings of it. So Beckett thinks on everything we just talked about, chews on it for a minute, and says, okay, we'll make 200 copies instead. Beckett then brings the manuscript of the Book of Nod to who he believes is actually a close ally of his, which he entrusts to make the copies. Unfortunately for everybody involved, this woman was actually posing as an ally of Beckett, and the woman was actually a Malkavian belonging to a different cult of Malkavians, similar to the Mnemosyne, but actually a rival cult of the Mnemosyne, known as the Jocastians, or the Jocastations. You'll probably hear me use both terms interchangeably. The Jocastation, posing as Beckett's ally, is named Aisha. The story of Aisha is pretty straightforward. She was born on the Ottoman-occupied island country of Cyprus in the year 1900, and from an extremely young age was a very rebellious kind of girl who all she really wanted was to escape the island of Cyprus. I mean, she would do everything in her power to try to get off the island, including posing as a boy to join the military, to which she was caught and then kicked out of the military. In Aisha's early 20s, she winds up coming across a group of anti-establishment rebel types who worshipped Satan and did occult stuff in the night. Aisha quickly realizes, after joining this cult, she quickly realizes that the other members of this cult would regularly give themselves up to the Satanists leading the cult. They had this infectious nature about them that Aisha was very clearly immune to. One night, Aisha throws the curtain open to this satanic cult headquarters, only to find a bunch of blood-sucking vampires instead. You see, these vampires were actually just using Satan as a way to attract other losers and bygones into their cult, aka Satanists. And when these vampires attempted to subdue Aisha using their disciplines, they realized that she was completely immune to them, which is entirely unheard of. These vampires then revealed to Aisha that they belonged to the bloodline of the Banu Hakim, or the Assamites, who agreed to help Aisha get off of the island of Cyprus so long as she assist in their next assassination mission. The target of the assassination of this Banu Hakim cult was a powerful Malkavian who belonged to a cult known as the Jocastations, or Jocastians, who would almost certainly be able to use his dementation, his Malkavian madness, to drive away the Banu Hakim hitmen trying to hunt him down. Which is, naturally, where Aisha comes in. the human used as bait who is naturally immune to the vampiric disciplines that a Malkavian would most certainly use to otherwise render her insane. On the night of the assassination, when Aisha was placed out in the open and in order to draw out the Malkavian, in a stroke of absolute genius on the Malkavian's half, the Malkavian recognizes that Aisha is naturally immune to disciplines, is like, oh shit, that's pretty cool, grabs her, and then runs off into the night, just takes off. Afterwards, the Malkavian embraces Aisha instead. Then, at some unknown point in the future, Aisha seems to have diablerized that very Malkavian. Perhaps the Malkavian Jocastian, much like the Mnemosyne, gave his life up or unlife up willingly. Perhaps it was something Aisha did. She was a rebellious type, and I don't think she exactly wanted to be turned into a Malkavian that night. And after that, reports would seemingly imply that Aisha's madness began to ramp up. It also became quickly clear to Aisha that after her embrace, she no longer possessed her supernatural immunity. In time, Aisha would also come to despise the Camarilla and the Sabbat, seeing the Camarilla as nothing but a bunch of elites who do nothing but inaction, and the Sabbats as a bunch of babbling idiots, basically. So the year is 1993. Aisha, disguised as an ally of Becektt, has just taken the manuscript of Nod from Becektt, and rather than make 200 copies of it, she takes it to a local publishing house instead, and had it published en masse to the world at large. But not before adding her own friggin' 8-page closing afterword to the collection created by the Mnemosyne, which makes all sorts of wild claims. The afterword left by Aisha, it's like a friggin' manifesto or something, where she roasts Beckett and Aristotle for hiding information from the world, that it's time for the world at large to learn the truth of the undead and of vampires. Her reasoning for leaking the Book of Nod is sort of explained, she sort of doesn't explain it, though her leaking of it seems primarily due to a general disdain of the Jyhad, for elder vampires, the games they play against the mortals, just like the games that she was forced to be a part of when she was growing up. She's tired of all of it, and boom, now it's time to show the world. She also starts doxing like a bunch of vampires throughout history, and a bunch of events that happened in history, and like, oh yeah, vampires did that. The Boston desegregation bus crisis of 1974, vampires did it. Persia, vampires. Remember Brunhilde from the Gangrel video? Aisha specifically calls her out for regularly fighting the Ventrue for the Ventrue's destruction of the land and nature of Northwest Europe, yet calls out Brunhilde for not doing anything about stopping the ecological destruction caused by the living. Aisha basically hit Brunhilde with the, if you cared about the land so much, then why didn't you stop Chernobyl? She even talks about the Ventrue of Rome and the destruction of Carthage. All this to say that Aisha is revealing to the reader that vampires are real, that they're lying monsters that cause schemes within schemes, and none of them, not even the one writing this, not even Aisha herself, can be trusted. No shit. Her closing paragraphs are basically taunts at who her real identity is, what her motives are. She's basically saying, so who am I, and why am I revealing this to you? Maybe I'm a mortal hunter and I made everything up and I'm actually working with the Inquisition. Maybe I'm actually a member of the Camarilla or the Sabbat. You don't know. Maybe I'm a little crazy, quirky, silly. Ooh. Who knows? Anyway, love you, bye. Yours truly, Aisha Jocastian. Go fuck yourself. Anyway, there you go. That is the story behind the creation of the modern vampire Bible, aka the Book of Nod, as compiled and translated by Beckett and Aristotle of the Mnemosyne, and as leaked to the world at large by Aisha of Jocastian. Aisha herself, as a result of leaking this information, committed the greatest breach of the masquerade ever, and still remains on the Camarilla's red list to this very night, which is, if you don't know, basically the Camarilla's most wanted list. The Book of Nod would continue to be printed in mass, and no measures were taken to stop it. After all, trying to hide its existence at that point would only be more suspicious, if anything. As for the Mnemosyne themselves, I suspect the Camarilla is quite divided on how to handle them. Does Beckett and Aristotle deserve punishment for compiling what is essentially illicit propaganda and material that fanatics like the Sabbat want to get a hold of? Or does the Camarilla simply ignore it? I mean, after all, it's not like the story told within the Book of Nod actually happened. Right? I suppose we'll never find out, since Becektt is damn near impossible to catch, and Aristotle is probably going to remain hidden in Paris, seeking more eldritch wisdom until Becektt consumes him. Pause. The final repercussions of the Book of Nod's publishing was the creation of the Revelations of the Dark Mother, which has its own meta-plot regarding its creation. We won't get into that now, just to know that when the Book of Nod was released to the world, some very, very, very angry worshiper of Lilith read it and was like, I'm gonna tell you the truth, and now we have this one. So, masquerade breaches on masquerade breaches at this point. And as for the woman who published this book, well, let's just say she's not on the red list for committing any masquerade breaches, because I'm pretty sure she walked out in sunlight and killed herself after finishing this book. Anyway, there you have it. If you are watching this and you haven't watched my other videos, but you want to know what's actually in the Vampire Bible itself, and while you're at it, you also get to know what's in the Revelations of the Dark Mother itself. You already know it, it's the Caine and Lilith video, give that a watch. This video is going to be the first of an ongoing mini-series in which the viewers, y'all viewers, will be able to help vote on what I'm going to discuss next. The decision will be made over on polls on the Patreon. We could pretty much jump off at any point after this. I mean, we could talk about the Revelations of the Dark Mother, or we could perhaps talk about something we have yet to talk about, which is the Aisha fragments. Aisha fragments? The Aisha fragments are essentially the Book of Nod, except way back in the Dark Ages. And it tells its own very fascinating story. Okay, anyway, thanks for watching.